Watch The Toxic Avenger now on Screambox. The radioactive superhero that's certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes is available to watch now from the comfort of your home. Bloody FM listeners get a special introductory offer by going to bit.ly/ToxyFM. That's bit.ly/ToxieFM for a special offer on Screambox.
Sometimes you gotta do something.
Welcome to this week's Safe Room, your weekly source for horror gaming discussions and proudly a part of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger.
And I'm the other one, Neil Bolt.
And this week we got an all-new feature for you highlighting a more recently released horror game that both Neil and I have played. We'll do some general thoughts on that before diving into a mechanic that's at the core of the experience that really does sort of make this a little bit more memorable than just another first-person horror experience before we dive into our grab bag, basically games that we've been playing over the course of the week and highlighting or, demifying, I suppose, some of the features found there within. But before we get into all that, Neil, how you doing this week, man?
Yeah, not too bad. It's a small grab bag of things this week, but got round to this game in particular, which had been it's one wanted to get round to a bit sooner, but yeah, we're here, and that's what matters.
That's the thing with this new magazine sort of format that we have. It's not always about the amount of games that we get to talk about in an episode, but if there's a feature there within that we find to be fairly notable, we can kind of give that the soapbox for the week, if you will, before diving into just the other elements of that game, and then getting to have some more broad conversations about games that, despite when they were released, we get to chat about whether they were notable for, well-intentioned reasons or not. But before we get into the games that we're going to chat about this week, as a bit of housekeeping, be sure, everybody, that if you've missed last week's edition of Horror Bites, in which Neil debuts the new theme of the month, that being Sometimes Dead is Wetter, our aquatic horror theme, in which we both picked a game in traditional Horror Bites fashion, a little bite-sized slice of aquatic dread that handles that subgenre in two distinctly different ways. So be sure to check that out if you haven't already, and then tune back into Horror Bites in 2 weeks' time for the next edition of that. So now that that's out of the way, let's get into our feature of the week, which is going to be Crisol Theater of Idols, which is a horror game that came out early this year. And it is yet another game that's been published by Blumhouse Games, and it's developed by Vermilion Studios. And this is a survival horror adventure that has some pretty clear inspiration, but at the same time, there's a core mechanic at the heart of it that gives it a little bit more, I suppose, notability than just being another, very pretty, but at the core of it being a homage. But yeah, this is set in, a sort of twisted Gothic religious depiction of Spain, in which this soldier basically crash lands on the shore and finds himself in this town that has been basically overrun with these, what would you call them, dolls or these mannequins, essentially, that have begun to kill the inhabitants of the island. Again, there's this religious, magical aspect behind everything that is influencing these horrific events. But to get right to it, that core mechanic, which we will be highlighting once we kind of get through our general thoughts, is there's no traditional ammo in this game for survival horror, first-person shooter. No, the traditional ammo has been replaced with weapons that can only use the player's own blood, which is a very sort of unique gimmick at the core of everything. And that means that for your traditional handgun, shotgun, submachine gun, if you will, you're not sort of rummaging around for individual bullets, but you are going to be actually puncturing your own flesh with these weapons and draining your blood. And that blood is going to be your ammo. So there's this very interesting sort of mechanic between, being able to dole out damage and at the same time ensuring you got just enough blood that you can keep on keeping on and surviving things. So I guess let's just start with, the general feelings on this. Neil, how did the opening hour or so of Crisol land for you?
In two ways, I think. I think it makes a really good impact initially. I think in terms of just how it looks. Like, I don't want to bring price into it, but a game that costs £15 at launch is like,
Yeah.
to look this good is like, wow.
Mm.
Like I know that's the beauty of Unreal Engine 5 is that sometimes it can do great things for making games look good. Sometimes technically it can have some problems that make them maybe not run as well as they could. But as an initial sort of look of it, it's wow, and it evokes so many things at once, as you said. There's the obvious influences like from Bioshock to Guillermo del Toro to Resident Evil 4. There's all these different things to it that make you. I mean, even a little bit of the darkness, maybe. I suppose which we talked about recently. It's very much 2010s shooter like that, and great. That's a great thing to be. That's initially. I think after that, it slows up a bit. And it kind of gets caught between like, are we playing this soft and safe, or are we trying to be more daring? And I think in trying to sort of explain how it works and getting you used to things, it's a little slow going in places, just as you get used to it. And there's lots of cut scenes, of course, which aren't like played out in first person in most cases. And so you kind of get a little impatient into, well, I want to get into the actual action of it more. And it's where you start to see where this is a smaller budget game, I think, in those early hours, is that you get a sense of, okay, I see where you've kind of made the compromises to sort of make this look good, that look good, great concept, great hook. But, like, it's not going to be a long experience. And it's like, how do you make that experience feel longer like that? And so I think the opening has that effect, whereas initially very promising, very like, oh, I want to know more, and it kind of just sort of slows down a bit too fast, like if you want to find ironically, just as it starts to teach you about the blood mechanic and all that. But I will get into it after that. But like it does start like settling into its groove after that. But it's slightly frustrating that that's the way it is, at that point. But I get that you want to kind of explain how everything works, and the story is obviously a big focus in this game as well. Very much in the vein of stuff like Bioshock in terms of like how it telling a story with twists and turns and like a mystery about the protagonist themselves and meeting strange characters and the like. But yeah, it's I suppose the best thing you can say for it in those early hours is it does feel like a 2010 shooter, for better or worse. And in some ways, it's when it tries not to be that kind of pace is where it feels like it is doing the worst of it. Yeah, in terms of like the over tutorializing of things. You've noticed, cutscenes mainly doing the explaining, I suppose. But it's still, gets a bit too sedate, and when it needs maybe to be quickening the pace. He says, taking 10 minutes to explain what you say. So.
No, I think if anybody that's listened to the show before will forgive you because of the fact that I yammer on for the first 5 to 8 minutes introducing shit. So you are more than fine there. But, in terms of this game's opening hour, I'm of two minds, right? Because I think that this is a game that from the jump, you can see some of the pretty clear influences, right? I think first and foremost is probably, and I'll be interested if you agree with me, is something like Bioshock, right?
Definitely Bioshock.
Yeah, you are being stranded in this location. You have some kind of special powers, but your bread and butter is your firearms. And the thing here that I think, Crisol does well is that power is tied to the firearms, right? So it almost simplifies things in a way which can be good and also, I suppose, overly simplifies the experience. But in terms of like actually retaining any sense of survival horror, it does a better job in that regard compared to something like Bioshock, which is more of like a first-person action horror shooter at the end of the day, whereas Crisol, I would say, has much more in line with survival horror because of that blood ammo mechanic that really does make you juggle with that, contrast of, do I want to have more health or do I want one extra bullet, or, a few extra bullets at that cost of, life and whatnot. And how does that set me up for going through this next area?
Yeah.
So I think in that regard, I definitely appreciated what this game goes for. And I think additionally to your point about, the framework of this game maybe feels very much like a classical Jesus at this point, something like 2010, sensibilities in terms of a shooter. But the production value here, I think, is really stellar. And much again, like BioShock, it has a very distinctive sense of space and place that's been established with, visiting this coastal village in Spain during this, typical festival that's tied to the intrinsic religion and various religions that are tied to the region. Like that aspect of it, I really liked. And there's like significance to the things that you are fighting. It's not just these, more or less demonic mannequins that are wearing various animal heads or these like sun masks. Like it's all tied to the culture in a way that is unique. And I think it just establishes a locale that is being used for more than just like a flavor of the month kind of a thing. It's actually like feels like it's tied to the locale. And at the end of the day, like the storytelling here, I think, again, is similar to BioShock in that, it goes about the audio log route of telling the backstories of characters, but that's tied again into like the blood mechanic, which we can get into when we talk more about the sort of nitty gritty of this one. But I do agree though, that like the first, I would say hour, 90 minutes or so, like the tutorial section.
Yeah,
It's
up to about
designed.
some of chapter 1, I think, as well, where it just, especially in the early going of it, it's still like, but yeah.
It's a little too, I suppose, almost archaic for me in terms of it being abiding by that 2010 sensibility where, like, if I was to replay this game, I would be hesitant of such because of how stringent I think that the opening hour is. Like, at least with thinking about, again, like BioShock's gonna be my frame of reference for this part, but like you can at least kind of like go through that opening section at your own pace, where the opening section of Crisol feels very restrictive in terms of your movement and the various types of things that you have to do. And so in that regard, for me, it was kind of like, okay, I'm really interested to explore more of this world and the unique take on it and presentation of gameplay. However, it felt like, there's a lot of these sort of like pigeonholed sections that are tied to, tutorials that are of a bygone era. But that being said, that didn't like deter me much from wanting to keep on plugging away for that opening, hour or so before you get to that first chapter.
Yeah, because as you said, it's incredibly detailed in terms of how it looks and giving you this history of this place, and weaving its own sort of mythology based on other mythologies into it as well. Like I'm a sucker for that stuff anyway, so that was great. And this whole thing of like, following different gods and being, an assassin of God, basically, in this sense, coming to rival turf, if you will, of the sea god, and dealing with this problem. Yeah, it's like, it was like the opposite to what you would, again, when we talk about 2010 shooter experiences, like when a lot of those protagonists would be like edgy, quipping sorts, gruff sorts, and here it's like a man of God, effectively, and the way that's done, that was a nice sort of spin on things like that, and like the body horror of sort of, when we'll get into the system of giving yourself effectively to continue your fight, like literally just like spilling blood to spill blood like that. It's a really cool idea. And like I said, as a world, like I said, you get intrigued by what it's doing, and you want to sort of know more and push on to find out where the story will take you and what else you will see. And I think the teases you get towards the end of the first, the epilogue, prologue chapter, and that really do just sort of give you enough to go, oh, okay, so yeah, like that. It's a nice payoff, at least, to sort of say, okay, I want to see where this takes us and what kind of game I'm getting.
Yeah, and I think that for all those features, like the mechanics themselves are pretty straightforward, right? It's the type of thing, once you understand, the letting of blood to progress your combat prowess, it isn't terribly difficult to understand. And again, like even the ways in which you can regenerate health, other than like finding these pools of blood that you can absorb once you basically have like a sun god that's imbued you with this power. You pick up syringes of blood that you inject just like plasmids, right? And so the fundamentals there are pretty simplistic. However, that gets to the sort of crux of this being our feature of the week, which is that blood mechanic. And, as we've already detailed what that entails, for you, I just want to know, like, how much of that like lends itself, that particular mechanic, to this having more of a potential survival horror feel, compared to, any number of other first person action horror presenting games that claim to be survival horror, but actually in practice, they're far from it.
Yeah, and I think this comes into that expectation versus reality thing that we've been talking about. Like, you go into expecting a certain kind of shooter because of the style of it, because of the influences that you can pick up from it. But because of this mechanic, it does inform the pace. Yeah, it makes it a slower paced game, because I think it would be very quickly frustrating with the way it is to try and work all these things out, with the gauging how much blood you have and not being able to really pause between these things like that. So you playing at a quicker pace would probably lead to you just like not paying enough attention to what you have left and what you can do. So I think that's where it becomes apparent later in the game, is that the pacing is deliberate, and you are very much like given just enough time to figure what you've got to do in a situation and gauge how much you can sacrifice in that given moment, and figure out in your inventory what you have to help you. Like, yeah, I mean, as much as I can criticize like beginning being quite tutorialized in terms of teaching you the things. It's useful enough that you know exactly what to expect and where to and what to look for and how to look for things. Like that. It's very, very, very straightforward, as you said, as well. Like, and most of it is not so much on rails, but there's very limited options in terms of exploration. So yeah, you kind of intuitively get to point A and point B, no problem like that. And yeah, it works pretty well, I think, in that pacing sense. Combat wise, I suppose I was going to say just quickly, it's just that I think you can have issues with like the combat itself, but I think the intention of the pace and the style are definitely like matched pretty well.
Yeah, I think that it ultimately makes combat, like, you approach it more strategically, I suppose, than you normally would. However, and I suppose I'll save what I was about to say in terms of combat in a moment, but like, I think that for me, it creates this really nice balance of prioritizing health over, damage output and vice versa, or at the same time, like actively promoting players not to forget about, melee combat, which is also a factor here in terms of like utilizing this knife that you have. That, much like the firearms, has its own restrictions. The fact that you can't overly rely on your knife. It's not like the wrench in BioShock. You have a certain amount of uses of it to parry enemy attacks, and that kind of ties into the powers that players can upgrade as well, which we can talk about in a minute. But I think overall, like for me, the bloodletting for ammo, just like, it is a gimmick, but I think overall, like, it does make combat feel a little more tense than it would be without it. Because without it, this is a game that you could probably steamroll in, less than a handful of hours. Whereas here, like, that notion of juggling, again, the health with ammo capacity, it really adds something to the experience in a way that you could say maybe it artificially inflates the difficulty because of that balance. But I think that for a game like this that has a foundation that's very clearly homage based, at the end of the day, like, it still makes for a more memorable, intense experience. And when it's presented as beautifully as it is here, I don't necessarily mind as much, I suppose, because it feels like the legwork has gone in and actually like establishing a world that is interesting to look at and interested in like learning more about, rather than just another Rapture imitator or something along those lines. But in terms of like combat in general, how did you find that sort of like ebb and flow? Whether that includes that bloodletting mechanic or just in general?
I think that initially, like once you obviously do whether you had the pistol and then you had the knife and sort of bang that out, it feels a bit like like for after a few sort of tries at it, and I think maybe the game waits a little too long to give you a different weapon to try things out, and that I think is where it starts opening up nicely. It is as you get each weapon, and like I mean, they all have the same basic idea, and the fun thing of this, bloodletting gimmick is like just seeing the animations for reloading for each thing. It's just like fucking cool every time.
Yeah,
Like the shotgun one is just great. Just
so
putting the
sick.
palm, just putting the palm into the case and things. So love it. It's but yeah, no, I do think that helps once you have a wider range of weaponry. You can really start to appreciate the strategy level of this, and then much the same way like good survival horror games do, where certainly ones that are more action focused anyway. I'm not entirely sold on the parrying system thing. I think it adds. I mean, it adds something, but like I think you could have done without it, and maybe had I don't know something blood related that's a bit different to it. It just it feels too much like this game did it, so we'll do it sort of thing. It's like, and unfortunately, parrying has been something that's been more popular in recent years again in all sorts of genres. And sometimes it works for some games, sometimes it does not. And I think one of the downsides of Unreal Engine 5, especially in games that aren't like fully optimized in-house stuff, is that the reaction times for things can be off, and especially when you've got to timing things. And there's some times here where you're like, it feels unfair. Like, and it's not really the game's fault. I think it's more about the engine not really translating things. But either way, it made me not want to use the knife very often, to be honest. Which unfortunately does mean you end up wasting more ammo, and which makes it more blood and like that. Which if that's your whole system, and you have this one issue, I mean, what I will say is it still allowed me to adapt, and I could sort of have a reprieve on the knife in a lot of cases, and still sort of methodically figure out, well, I know if I hit them like this and I give myself space here, because of the pacing, you do start to get an idea of what you can do in levels, and like I said, because there aren't many options in terms of where you can go. Yeah, you start to approach it in a very classic first-person shooter style, but on a sort of slower tilt, and sort of strafe your way around the arena and think, okay, and give yourself time to sort of assess the situation. It's in that sense, it is quite fascinating that you do have like that strategy way of doing in a turn-based strategy or real-time strategy where you would basically line up things, see what you can do, and then click whatever. Doing that in like from a first-person perspective in real time is quite interesting. I think that's. I mean, we've seen survival horror in first person before, of course, but I think here, because it's more traditionally like a first-person shooter than a lot of those first-person survival horrors tend to be, it's an interesting mix at that point, and it is one of the better parts of using this sort of amalgamation of systems.
Yeah, I think that I totally agree in terms of like that melee system, because that's one of the things that like early on when you first are starting to get your first basically like powers that feed into the abilities of either firearms, blood consumption, or your knife. I was like, oh, cool. I'm going to get this. I'm going to boost my parrying ability, which basically says like if you successfully parry, then you get this basic like small health buff or
Yeah.
a bump. But to your point, like it doesn't work as seamlessly as it should. And if that's going to be a major feature of combat for players, then that really needs to be refined to the degree that it should be. Now, that could be Unreal 5 related, it could be a facet of the gameplay, but that was something that like early on I initially felt disappointed by because of the fact that I like started to boost that and then it didn't end up being as reliable as it should have been. Which furthermore, when I start to think about, you know, approaching combat, you want to have all these options, but all the options need to be viable. And if anything, that kind of just put me off to the initial take on combat because of, you know, how dire that can be and how you really have to be fighting for your life at some points where it's just like, yeah, like there's instances where you're going to be very low on blood because of the fact that you've been overly boosting your ammo count. And then all of a sudden you find yourself with barely any health and enemies hit pretty hard in this, even on
Yeah.
the normal difficulty. So that kind of like complicates things. And then I found myself falling back on like, oh, okay, so I'll just like do what you did, which is say strafe the background, which isn't always the most satisfying approach to combat.
No, yeah, I get that. Like I said, it's
So
like as a shooter, it
Mhm.
shouldn't really be the way of things. But I think it is because of this very particular style they have
Mhm.
chosen that it feels like that's almost intentional, you know, to me,
Mm.
that that's an option.
Sure. Yeah, no, and I think that overall though, for me, like that was one of the instances that kind of, if anything, pushed me further down the rabbit hole of really boosting my guns abilities, which
Mm.
once I got over that initial hump, it wasn't that big of a deal because of the fact that I started to buy and upgrade abilities that really sort of like promoted an emphasis on the firearms, which is that, you know, there's one where if you bolster your ability with your firearm, every bullet that you fire leading up to the final round in a magazine will boost the damage output, which again ends up being huge. You can bolster the abilities of basically using blood vials and these things, and the sort of killing enemies will boost the amount of essence that you can be rewarded with from killing enemies. And so, you know, you find this sort of like style of combat and abilities that really sort of complement the play style you're going for. It just happens to take a little bit longer, maybe, than it should to get there. But at the same time, like, I think that overall things even out the further into the game you get. But that opening, I don't know, 3 hours, I'll say, like, combat is not always very satisfying because of the fact that enemies are quite resilient. They hit really hard. And until you start pumping upgrades into your guns and abilities, that pistol feels a little bit like a pea shooter until you get that shotgun, as you mentioned. But then, you know, it's a double barreled, so you're quite limited in just how effective it is. I don't think combat ever was totally frustrating for me, but I think that there were a little bit of growing pains for that opening 2 to 3 hours, but I never was like completely perturbed. I don't know. It's difficult to get what I'm saying. It's just, it was a mixed bag, I suppose, in that regard, but I never was like, didn't want to keep pushing forwards is what I'm trying to get at.
I think again it goes back to the kind of era it evokes. That there were a lot of those games that had that, where it's like you kind of ate shit on things that you didn't care about to get to the stuff you did care about. Like there's, you know, certain sections maybe or certain mechanics that didn't really like gel with you, and that's fine. You know, like because there was something in it that made you want to keep going and keep playing. Now, I think we should at least though caveat this game with the same way we caveat like stuff we can't cover on say Horror Bites, in that it is a very small team like that, and they've really gone swinging for the fences with this and done very well. I think that if you were to have a criticism of that, is that this whole upgrade system and power system maybe would have been better in terms of exploration to just go find upgrades rather than find money for upgrades, because again it comes back to that choice system of like, well, I only have this amount of money to pay for these upgrades, so I'll do whatever. Like I'll have to put it into this because I don't know how much I'm going to get going down the line. I don't really need to be upgrading into a part of the game I don't want to, in like the knife, for instance.
Mm.
So I think having like incremental upgrades like to weaponry that complement your powers would have been more interesting. I understand it would have streamlined the game further and made it feel smaller. I think the smart choices they've made here all relate to like using this minimalist idea, like, and making it feel grander than it is, like that, and not just visually, but just in terms of like the world building and like the ideas, like that. Simple's fine. It would be fine. You don't have to have like this big, multifaceted set of mechanics to feel like you're playing with the big boys. You can be a really good shooter and do things very basically. Like it's fine. But yeah, I get why they try to sort of push and push and push. But I suppose the positive thing there is you can look at it and go, this is what they do the first time out. If it works for them and it's successful enough, and again, Blumhouse games very much applying the same logic as they do to films. So in the early days of like, okay, it's not big budgets, but enough that we can make decent money out of it if it's a moderate success. And I think this looks like it could be. I think word of mouth in the horror community has been quite good for this as well. So yeah, I think what this studio could do with a sequel or another game, possibly with a bigger budget and more experience. Yeah, I think they'll learn lessons of this, and we could see something really special. I think the fact that they've managed to make it feel like their own thing and not try too hard to be a modern game, in every single facet, is to their credit. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to what they bring it to us next.
Yeah, and to your point, I wanted to circle back before we wrap with this, like the price point on this. When I initially saw, I think in the States here, it's $18. I thought that was a sale price, and that's just what the game goes for. And like at that value, it really does harken back to this older age of pricing for like these mid-budget games. But at this point, this is like a budget price for a game that, even with some of the criticisms I might have of it, I think it's still well above. It's well worth more, like a higher price than even that. The fact that it's under $30 for as strong as it is in terms of its artistic style, but also like that mechanic, and that does add something to the overall experience. I think for Vermilion Studios, it's a great first game, and furthermore, it shows Blumhouse maybe is a little bit more discerning than, I'm only speaking for myself, like I thought that they would be in terms of the types of games that they were going to be publishing, right? I think initially when we talked about Blumhouse getting into games publishing, the fear there for me was very much tied to like the fact that, they started quite strong, and then we started seeing Blumhouse producing any number of films every month, and a majority of those ended up being garbage. Now, don't have that crystal gaming ball to see what the future looks like in terms of them publishing games, but like at least between Crisol, Theater of Idols, and Fear the Spotlight, which you've spoken to positively previously here, and I said as much to you before the podcast, like I want to now play Fear the Spotlight. It seems like they're a little bit more discerning in terms of the types of games that they're going to be publishing, and if anything, granted, it's the only one I played by them, like Crisol, Theater of Idols, I think would be a fine starting point for people that, like me, maybe were initially skeptical of them getting in the game space, but this is quite a strong offering in that regard, especially for that budget price.
Yeah, and the tentpole thing that Blumhouse are eventually putting out is obviously Sam Barlow's new game as well, which with Brandon and Cronenberg. So yeah, I mean that's like, Christ, yeah, that feels like it could be like next level stuff. But yeah, these games in the early going are like promising, in terms of like they're varied in style, and yeah, they feel inventive. I think we said before when we've talked about this, Blumhouse, the things they're good at in the film space in terms of budgets and stuff, I think that works better here because the expectations are different, and
Mhm.
people making the games are going to make the games they want to make, and that's great like that. And so we don't just get like, well, not yet anyway. We don't get the Truth or Dares and Fantasy Islands of this world, like it's.
Well, hopefully that's not the type of thing I'll say soon enough to, but we'll have to wait and see. But I think that at least in terms of between the two of us, what we've played of theirs, we're a little bit more optimistic about the future, especially with, as you said, that Sam Barlow, Brandon Cronenberg collaboration on the horizon there. But yeah, Crisol again, like a budget price, but a bit more notable than just another sort of budget horror shooter experience, if you will. But yeah, I think we'll take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll dive into our grab bag for the week, in which we both have been playing. It's not exactly about the quantity of games, but perhaps we'll be speaking to the quality of what we were able to make time for this week. But we'll have more on those games in a moment. And we are back from our break. And Neil, do you want to kick things off by telling us about Raft from Red Beat Interactive?
Yeah, which came out in 2022 initially, and to me it was like there's been a bunch of like seafaring survival games. Yeah, we've mentioned them before. Yeah, stuff like Subnautica, but but it's I think there's a game called Stranded Deep, stuff like that. But yeah, this is very much set on the ocean most of the time. Like you awaken on a small raft, and from there you have to like get anything like that sort of comes by like throwing out this makeshift grappling hook to sort of pull in debris, whether that be bits of wood, plastic, leaves and whatever, and then craft the basics you need. So there'll be the odd bit of food that might come by, and you could end up building a fire. Anything you would think in a normal survival game. It's like make stuff to eat, make stuff to make your journey easier for fishing, for fighting. And I mean, in the early game, it's just vast, vast ocean. Don't see a lot of land. You're building stuff up, but there's always the presence of a shark, like just around. So eventually, you will have to go in the water, like to do stuff. But initially, you are just trying to stay on, and obviously, it's very easy to fall off the raft if you haven't done the right thing in terms of like barriers and things. And early on, you don't really do that. But yeah, so occasionally the shark will come and attack the raft and bite chunks off it, and you have to fight it off. But yeah, it kind of really explodes from the deeper you go into it, where it stops being just about being on the ocean, and you will just like discover like these abandoned islands and like rigs and like even like a little city type place at some point. But obviously, you also go underwater a few times, and you can distract the sharks and avoid the things. But all the while, you're building this raft up to become more of like a home, a floating home, which I really like the idea of that you are just like building a home base that is constantly moving. Like, and the fact that you have some control as you go on. You can build anchors and sails and things like that to sort of steer you in the right direction. But the fact that you could just miss something because you didn't, do the right thing at the right time. It does feel very much like a game that suits co-op first, in terms of like that, because then you can sort of communicate what you want to do. You can all do different tasks, but yeah, it's really quite interesting. And the places it goes in terms of like expansive. I definitely prefer the early game stuff, the peril of it, in terms of like how limited your resources are, how quickly you start dehydrating and getting hungry and like just finding stuff like that. But yeah, the sooner you start learning its little mechanics, like how to like plant seeds and how to sort of turn salt water into fresh water and stuff like that. I think there's something really unique about it in a survival space, and I really do like the idea of like a floating island home and the mystery of like why you're just out in the middle of nowhere. Um,
Mm.
there's these occasional weird glitches where nothing will be like no debris will appear on the water. You're just sailing into infinite nothingness, and it's like it's kind of weird in that sense, but that's a rarity. And
Mm.
yeah, it's like it's one of those games again where I think that with people it probably wouldn't be quite so intimidating, but I think doing these things solo, and obviously it has a day-night cycle as well, so it's like it does just start to feel like a real battle for survival. Because like say you've got crops growing on your raft, like you walk away from them, birds will come and start pecking at them to try and eat them, and obviously the shark can turn up whenever it does, and maybe you back up too far and end up in the water, and you've got a sail on your raft and it's sailing too far ahead of you, and you panic, and that numbing feeling of like dropping into the water and like no by accident, and like feeling vulnerable in those early hours. It's just it's terrifying. It's like the thing I don't like doing. Like sharks in oceans and games like is still like something that gives me the heebie-jeebies, and
Mm.
it's like it's like I try my damnedest not to end up in the water like every time. But as the game goes on, it does give you more tools to sort of feel braver about doing that, and just the idea of just like suddenly finding an island, anchoring, and just exploring something like after all this like all this time just being on this vast ocean surviving, just anything that's a respite from that is great and fun. Just to sort of explore, and I like that about it, that it is like some of my favorite sort of survival games is the isolation of it all, like how lonely you feel in it, and it really makes it feel like a proper survival experience.
I really like the idea of having a progressive, I suppose, goal being other than just surviving is like bolstering your home base, if you will. I think that's a really cool feature here. And if anything, to me, it sounds like that's the aspect of this maybe that I suppose a lot of survival games are like building up a base, but at the same time, like this notion that it's intrinsically tied to navigating in the sea is pretty cool. And I hadn't heard of this game previously, but just in like checking out the Steam page, it looks like ultimately, are you either discovering cities or are you building up cities on masses of land or islands?
The idea, I think, is basically that something has happened to the world that's pretty much raised the sea level. So it's like there are like pockets of humanity here and there, and
Okay.
so that's why the ocean is so vast. That's why there's very little land to find. But so you will find stuff, and again, it plays into the underwater stuff. So you will find things underwater that wouldn't normally be underwater. But obviously all along, your home base is your home base, and it's doing all the jobs. By the time you get to bigger sizes, like you're taking a couple of minutes to sort of go around and do all your sort of daily chores, so to speak. And it's like it's a nice mix of things in that regard.
Did you get to spend much time trying to play this with randoms online? Because it seems like multiplayer is a big, obviously.
Yeah, no, it's
aspect of
like
this.
I did prefer playing it on my own with this one. Like just it's like just because like I said, the isolation thing of it, it's the weird way I am about these sort of games where it's like, I quite enjoy it that way. But like I said, it does feel very multiplayer focused to me, like in terms of what it does do. But I do think that again, like many games that have that in the horror space or horror adjacent space, it does feel like that would nullify some of the danger in it. Like it just feels like a goof off at that point. And I'd rather do that further down the line when I've had the experience first. Because I remember that quite well with Dying Light, for instance, where I enjoyed it as the solo game it was, and then playing with people, it kind of, as fun as it was, it did kind of knock the danger out of it a bit, and make it feel more like a pissing about sort of thing.
Yeah, from I guess my own experience with like survival games that have this horror, or either adjacent horror or overtly horror. Like last thing I played was The Forest, and that wasn't as much of a group effort. It was more of like me and another person, but I ultimately felt like, yeah, to really retain that the horrors of surviving, rather if there's monsters or not. The isolation aspect of playing by yourself is like pretty important in my opinion, but at the same time here, like when the end goal is either exploring these land masses or building up this base, I could see that potentially like this would be one game that playing with people, even randos or not, might end up being somewhat more beneficial. But yeah, just in terms of like the depths of the mechanics here,
Yeah.
how did you find them compared to other survival games that you've played? Like, was there a great crafting system in terms of like the actual building of the base? What did you think of those kinds of mechanics?
Yeah, I think like any of them, when you initially play them, and especially with games in this genre, they don't tend to explain a lot. They let you figure it out as you go along. So yeah, those initial hours of it are like, what the fuck? How do you do anything? What's this going like that? And as with many of those games, like the first run you do, you're like, yeah, I'm starting again, like sort of thing, because you'll figure something out and go, okay, so I can save myself time by figuring this out, figuring that out. And yeah, I like that. Like trial by fire, trial and error stuff. It's perfect for the survival genre, and like the idea isn't that you necessarily win; it's that you survive. That's it. Survival is the goal, and it should always be the goal. And my favorite survival games are the ones that do that, and just feel like you could go on forever, but obviously you're not going to, because you will. I mean, it's a bit softer on certain difficulty levels that you can just like respawn your stuff and like not lose it, but it does feel like, again, you want to have that danger, you want to feel everything's a bit more perilous. So yeah, like I don't mind that. The mechanics are good for what they're doing, and like by the time you understand what to do with it, like everything else becomes a bit more intuitive.
Nice. Well, we'll have to potentially check that one out.
What about you though? What
Yeah.
have you been playing?
Yeah, this week, other than the stuff that I was playing in terms of like horror bites, again, people and should definitely come back the following week so they can check out part 2 of horror bites. Sometimes dead is wetter. I spent a good amount of time with a game that I missed from not only last year but 2 years ago even. Geez, a game I think we covered for horror bites for a demo, which would be Angerfoot from developer
Yes.
Free Lives, and it's naturally been developed by the Adult Swim of indie publishers, that being Devolver Digital. This is a game that kind of blends my love of fast-paced, frantic gameplay. You might call it erratic in some regards, but it really taps into what I think made the Hotline Miami games so good. That notion of 1 or 2 hits and you're dead basically, and the sort of like speed running erratic nature of that gameplay. However, instead of being a top down game like Hotline Miami, Angerfoot is a first person game. So you're running through these very linear maps that are filled with various types of goons, and your main unlimited means of killing these goons and trying to complete levels as quickly as possible is, you guessed it, your feet. So you can basically, in true Duke Nukem style, you can use your Foot of Doom and just basically kick the shit out of enemies and jump and do these like jump kicks. In addition to picking up firearms that have a very limited amount of ammunition to kill enemies. But it really is about this kind of like almost tapping into like my Quake days of ensuring that you're dodging gunfire, incoming attacks, and killing enemies as quickly as possible. And I think in terms of like the core gameplay, it's very refined, if not somewhat simplistic, because of that notion of like, you're kicking your way to survival. But also like this game has a great Adult Swim kind of sensibility when it comes to humor. Like you have these ridiculous assortment of enemies, like everybody, you're fighting alligators in track suits with baseball bats. You're fighting these like hoods in Adidas jumpsuits that have firearms and whatnot. And you basically are like this very muscular jort wearing rendition of the Ninja Turtles. as you kind of like jump and kick and shoot your way through these environments again as quickly as possible. And there's this kind of like, oh, man, I don't know, this like Eastern European shitty house techno soundtrack that's playing over everything. Like it's a very like brash game, but it's in the best sense of it, like is very aware of that. So like you're fighting all these basically hoods, and then like even when you die, they go from like trying to kill you with that shitty music playing in the background to the shitty music keeps playing, but you see them like dancing and mocking you in the background. Like it's very much, of course, a continuation of the demo that we covered, but there's a bit more in terms of like the variety of environments, the verticality of the environments, the abilities of the enemies that you're fighting. It's not just bats and guns, but you encounter these enemies that are like suicide bombers, or they throw grenades, or they have shields, so they're impervious to gunfire. Like there's a great deal of complexity, even if it seems simplistic to the game, in terms of like your ability to traverse in as safely and as quickly as possible for each of these levels.
So obviously the demo, I think one of the concerns we had at the time was like maybe it would start to feel a bit too repetitive. Like, so beyond that though, how does it sort of evolve the idea, the gimmick, if you will, of this like foot heavy gunplay?
So in that regard, that was, I totally remember that being one of our major concerns. I think that for me, and I've played maybe a handful of hours of it, I definitely don't find myself playing for long stretches because, again, it is a relatively straightforward type of experience. But in terms of like longevity overall, there is a good amount of like challenges for each of the levels. And, you know, you get stars based on achieving those challenges. Each level, you automatically get 1 star if you complete the level. And then there's like time-based challenges. And then there's also like challenges that are tied to not using firearms, try not to jump during it, like these different challenges that like increase the complexity of them. But in that complexity, like it sounds like one of those situations where it's like, oh, cool, this is just prolonging the same experience. But in actuality, every 5 stars, you can purchase a new type of shoe, and those shoes give you new abilities in various ways. So like, in one instance, you get a pair of Chuck Taylors. If you're wearing Chuck Taylors, every time you kick an enemy to death, it replenishes the gun you have equipped with 1 bullet. Or there's Timberlands, and if you're wearing the Timberlands and all the enemies have extra large heads, which naturally make them easier for blowing their heads off with a handgun. And so like these little types of multipliers or challenges will allow you just a hair more ease with which to get through some of these environments. But I think that even if you didn't have those aspects, what I've found is that the environments themselves are evolving and the types of enemies in them are evolving to the degree that for me, the gameplay remains generally unchanged, but the environments are presenting new challenges in new ways, in a way that is still making it very entertaining for me. So I suppose that all boils down in a long-winded way of saying, like, if you play the demo and you're bored by the demo, the game is probably not going to ever evolve into anything that you find is more entertaining. However, if like us, you had fun with the demo, there's going to be new levels of challenge here that are able to evolve on those core mechanics in ways that will prolong the challenge and your overall enjoyment, I think, of what Angerfoot has to offer. And I think overall, like, again, like the sort of aesthetic of it, if you will, the like shitty house music aesthetic is pretty entertaining. And there's some like juvenile humor to go along with that. Like I would much rather play something like this than, oh fuck, now I'm forgetting. Life is Weird. Is that the first person shooter Adult Swim game that came out?
Oh, High on Life?
High on Life. That's what it was. Yeah. Like I would much rather play something like this that feels informed by those Adult Swim sensibilities than something like High on Life, which feels like the same joke over and over. Here, it's like, might not evolve much, but the gameplay is a little more compelling for me.
Yeah, I mean, the developer Freelisers like had a good history of like just doing over the top crassness, like back from games like Broforce, like which is like side
Yeah.
scrolling
Hmm.
80s action inspired thing, and I mean genital jousting, which is went
Speaks for
viral in
itself.
its own way. Yeah, I mean it's very sedate by comparison, but like obviously the concept of it as a game is just ridiculous, and it's not one you can play in front of the family. Let's put it that way. But,
Right.
and stuff like Gorn, like the VR game, like which is a lot of the same sort of things you can see come through. I think in Angerfoot, like in terms of just having like this big, chunky, foopy combat that's like just over the top, and yeah, there's a very clear sort of through line in most of their stuff where you had this sensibility of being just ridiculously crass and absurd, but really funneling it down to a certain kind of thing. And yeah, I think you are either into that or you're not. Like, I don't think you can sort of grow to love that. It's
Right.
obnoxious for many people, I'm sure. But yeah, I like it because it does just remind me of those sort of, I don't know, early 2000s, as you said, adult swimmy, sort of late night TV, experimental stuff, animation stuff. And yeah, I think Angerfoot's definitely like, just shows that they can keep on keeping on with that, as you said.
Yeah, and I mean, what you see is kind of what you get, but even if maybe let's say like that adolescent humor is not your favorite type of humor, I think that people that are into like speed running games and the challenge there within will get a little bit more out of this because that's not even necessarily the type of gameplay that I'm into. However, I still found myself really like trying challenges more often than not and spending more time with the levels because of the fact that I wanted to unlock those new shoes, which potentially might ease some of my pain later on in those levels and achieving other types of things. So, I think the game retails for like $20. When I bought it, it was on sale. I think it was down to like less than 10. I would say that even at 20 though, like if you're into those types of experiences, you'll get your money's worth in that regard. Certainly though, it's kind of a no-brainer for me if it was on sale on Steam, but even still, like it's an entertaining game, and the graphical style almost reminded me of that like Muppet survival horror game that we played.
Oh, My Friendly Neighborhood, yeah.
Yeah, My Friendly Neighbor. It has a similar art style to that that I think is
it's a bit like
amazing.
I like to Eastman and Laird or like classic super like 90s cartoon sort of weirdness like that, but
Mhm.
funneled through that sort of late night TV, the early 2000s sort of thing. It's a you can almost feel the time and place the developers grew up in a lot of
Mhm.
it, I think, and the influences. So yeah, it's like I said, that very distinct feel, which unfortunately, as you said, some things like High on Life are kind of the same association as in the way that modern Adult Swim stuff is, like where
Mhm.
it's a bit more hit and miss. But yeah, I do like that visual sort of thing going on with it.
Yeah. So I definitely highly recommend that. And if anything, it makes me just excited to see what they're able to do next. Because, like you said, they have a firm sort of like footholding in this like crash style of humor. But in terms of like developers that are able to take their whether it's humor sensibilities, whether it's their genre sensibilities, but continually apply that to like new facets of gameplay and new genres. Because like Broforce, I was a huge fan of, and then to see them go on to like genital jousting and be completely different, but at the same time, just like sticking true to their guns in terms of like the experience they want to do. It might be crass, it might be vulgar, but it's an entirely new type of experience, and more often than not, they're achieving what they set out to do, and each project is fundamentally different than the last. So I think that makes them a developer that hopefully will continue to work with developer Evolver Digital rather, and just see their
Yeah.
projects continue to get the sort of like recognition I suppose they deserve that comes with working like a publisher like that.
Yeah, and it's really weird. I think just because I don't focus on games in the same way I used to. It's like I always keep thinking I don't remember the last time I played a Devolver Digital game, and I always look back and go, "Oh, I played loads, and I generally
Hmm.
love them." Like,
Yeah.
it was like when we were talking about this, and I was like, played of those recently because I can't remember the last Devolver game. And then it was like,
Mhm.
oh, what All X Pit, which I spent like 45 hours in this year already, like, and Baby Steps, which was like one
Mm.
of my favorites from last year, and stuff like that. But like, yeah, I mean, of course, Look Outside. Yeah, that's we
Mm.
highlighted last year. It's mad. You just quickly forget sometimes who's doing it.
Yeah.
And I should know, seeing the fact I've seen the bloody logo, how every time I've booted up All X Pit. So. But yeah, it's nice that they're still going nicely with that. I didn't even realize they published that Quarantine Zone game as well, which is that's done
Oh, yeah.
very well. And of course, they got one of your demo favorites coming up, isn't they, with Shroom and Gloom? They're publishing
Mhm.
that. So,
Yes. Oh my god,
yeah.
yeah. That's gonna be, that's one of my most anticipated's coming up, and I'm so pained every time I see something, it's like a developer blog and not a release date for that, so, uh, not that I don't wanna learn more about that game, but
Oh
at the
yeah,
same time, like, I'm just, I'm dying for that game because of the fact, again, like, you know, it's no new revelation, but, like, Devolver Digital is one of those publishers that really is able to identify unique approaches to gameplay, and it seems like, also, like, visual styles kind of like latch onto these things that are very unique in how they look and how they play, and more often than not, they end up being some games that really resonate with me, in a big way, even if it's something like this that is a little bit less, strategic minded, but at the same time, has no less of a unique approach to kind of gameplay. Um,
yeah.
so
That's it.
I
It
think,
stands out.
yeah, by and large, they know what they're doing in terms of like presenting, or bolstering games that, are from developers that really are going out of their way to like try something new each time, but if
Mm,
anything, like building upon mechanics and, sensibilities that, worked in the past, but aren't resting too heavily on them.
that's it.
Yeah. But unless you had anything else, I think that's going to round out our grab bag for the week.
No, no, that was it
Mm,
really. Like, I've
mm,
covered many of the other things I've been playing, like a lot
mm.
now. So,
Yeah, that's the thing. I always have. I was talking to you before we started recording. I always have like Mugenics in my back pocket for an update on that. But I think, once you get to spend a little bit more time of it, that's one we'll revisit in the future for a grab bag. Because, as I'm learning at 30 hours in already, I think I'm only sort of like dipping my toes into what that game has to offer. So,
yeah,
I'm excited to chat about that one in the future at some point. But, at the same time, like, yeah, got a good, not incredible, quantity of games, but I think we had some good quality this week to chat about, as, I'm sure we will next week.
yeah, absolutely will.
But, until then, my friend, as always, it's a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
Back at you, my man. Until the next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's main feed episode of Safe Room. If you've enjoyed our horrifying discussions, please take a moment to rate and review the show on your preferred podcast platform, as this helps us immensely in ensuring that the show continues to grow. For any and all show updates and additional content, you can follow Safe Room on all of our socials, which are linked in the episode notes, at SafeRoomPod. And finally, you can send any and all emails to saferoompod@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you guys next time.
Watch The Toxic Avenger now on Screambox. The radioactive superhero that's certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes is available to watch now from the comfort of your home. Bloody FM listeners get a special introductory offer by going to bit.ly/ToxyFM. That's bit.ly/ToxieFM for a special offer on Screambox.
Sometimes you gotta do something.